Okay. The assemblies are working hard on reconstructing our lawful government and are steadily growing. The question came up, what is our true start over point? Is it the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, or something else?
Well, I suppose that in a sense, it does start in England many, many years ago. If you really want to go to a starting point, you would have to go back to the Norman Conquest. And then you would have to go to what is called the settlement of the Norman Conquest, which happened upon the death of William the Conqueror. Now, of course, there are things that go back into history even deeper, but if you want to just deal with the modern world and with our part in the modern world, then you would have to go to William the Conqueror and the settlement of the Norman Conquest upon his death. William, as you all know, was a French king, and he was an heir in Normandy to the kingdom of Gaul. And he had decided that as a competitor and thorn in the flesh of France, that England had to be dealt with, and that it had to be left without the ability to ever become a true monarchy again. And so for those reasons, he, upon his death, split up all of England, everything that he won in the Norman Conquest. He had taken a, what would you call it, an inventory. And he had the Doomsday and the Domesday books. And the Doomsday books recorded the former ownerships and the people that were under the former administration and monarchy. And the Domesday book recorded those that were basically with William and all of their property and whatnot. And out of this, upon his death, he established miniature kingdoms throughout England. And he gave these kingdoms, principalities, whatever you want to call them, he gave these plots of land and homes and farms and properties to his loyal barons who had followed him across the English Channel and who had fought for him in the Norman Conquest. And he made them sovereigns in their own right. So instantly, all across England, you had all these little kingdoms. There was no way to have one British king ever. And that was his intent. He also took the further step of castrating his oldest son and denying property ownership of any kind, any land ownership, to King John. Okay? So that they would not inherit.
And he became king of the Commonwealth?
Well, that's what they call it. But there's actually no king involved in a Commonwealth.
No.
It's another oxymoron, right? There's an overseer for the Pope in a Commonwealth. And so there really is no office for a British king or monarch, and hasn't been for 10 centuries.
Because that originated in 1066. Is that kind of the starting point there?
No, the starting point of the independent sovereignties was in 1087 when William the Conqueror died.
Okay.
But if you fast forward from then, William denied land ownership in England to his own sons so that there would never be a king of England. You see, it was a complete plan that England would never have a monarch of its own again, a single monarch of its own again. And so that's why King Henry had to go back to France and marry Eleanor and all the other stuff that went on in order to get any kind of claim of royalty himself in that venue. You see, they had to do this kind of waltz me around again, Willie, trying to share out monarchical power and titles and all the rest of it.
That explains a lot.
It really does once you understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go forward to the time of the Magna Carta, and what do you see? Oh, well, here are all the barons again. These are like the sons and grandsons and great-grandsons of the Norman barons that received their individual sovereignty from William. And they are now facing a situation where they're being taxed basically by the Pope, and they are objecting to inroads and demands being made upon them by the theocracy. And so we come to the Magna Carta, and what do you have? You have, quote unquote, King John, the grandson of the original John, and you have the progeny of the barons living in their little fiefdoms all over England. And so you have the Magna Carta being imposed upon the Commonwealth King, John, by the barons, but they're not barons in England. See, that's also part of the deceitfulness of British history. They called them barons because they were barons in France, but they are kings in England. They have their own separate sovereignty in England. So British history calls them barons because they were barons in France, but then just kind of neglects to tell you that, oh, by the way, they were sovereign in England.
More semantic deceit, it seems like.
More semantic deceit. The same thing applies to, their adoption of Camelot. The Brits have adopted the entire story of Camelot, but Camelot is French.
Yeah.
And so you're going to search for a long, long time for Camelot and evidence of Camelot's existence in England, because it really didn't exist in England. It existed in France. Go figure. But you have to love the English for keeping it alive and adopting it as their own nonetheless, because out of that construct, out of Camelot, came the idea of might for right. And that is also what impelled the barons in adopting the Magna Carta. And there are people who will come forward as revisionists in the present day and try to tell you that, oh no, the Magna Carta doesn't apply. The Magna Carta wasn't real. The Magna Carta couldn't be enforced because King John objected to it. I have news for you. The Magna Carta was entirely enforceable by the barons, each of them contributing in their own sovereign right to enforce the Magna Carta. Sure. This was an entire group of kings standing against the plenary power of the Pope and saying, no, this is how we're going to do things. This is how we're going to limit powers of government over the people and over us. And here it is, blah, blah, blah. Just read it. And there we sign it as sovereigns in our own right in England.
Pretty ingenious plan.
Well, yes, it was a genius plan. And so was William's genius plan to limit Britain to not having a monarch.
Right.
I mean, he did what he meant to do.
Yeah.
And did it in spades.
That's pretty amazing. And just going back to Camelot for a moment, you've written a couple of lovely articles about Camelot and about Galerie du Lac. I'm probably not saying that correctly. Would you pronounce
Gilroy.
Gilroy?
Gilroy is the French for William the King, basically. And William is an old family name that goes all the way back among the kings of Gaul. And it basically means resolute protector.
Mm.
And if you think about it, that's exactly what you want from a king or a government, is resolute protection.
Yeah. Yes.
So there's really something more to that name than we commonly appreciate. You know, we just slap somebody on the back and call him Bill, but in French, Gilroy, or, you know, and in English, it's William. So that name has a special meaning. It's not just William, it's William the King.
Mm.
And so the kings of Gaul from ancient times to the present have all carried the name Gilroy, resolute protector, king of the Gauls.
Mm.
And what had happened is that this was one family at one time of Norman French who migrated farther west. You know, one part of the family stayed in Normandy and in Gaul as the ruling family. And the other part of the family moved west and established itself in central and western England. Okay. So you've got, you know, cousin George over here, cousin Bill over there, right? And they go back and forth across the English Channel, and they trade together, and they have, you know, they trade men at arms, and they educate their children back and forth, and everybody knows everybody, and it's a family affair to rule in both places. And what happened is that the Queen of Powys in central England was married to a Irish Welsh chieftain as a effort to bring together the people of Western England and the people of Central and Eastern England together by sort of, you know, a marriage contract among the monarchs would result in a marriage among the people, and there would be peace and plenty, and everybody would get along much better. It was that sort of a contract marriage. And so the Queen of Powys, the princess, I should say, was Christian. But the Irish Welsh chieftain that she married was not. And this was all happening at the time where paganism was giving way to Christianity in the 400s to 700s. All these things were happening at the same time. So individual families were Christian or not. And within, you know, even within the families, there were members that were still of some pagan belief system and those that were Christian, and, you know, everybody got along together. And, you know, over time, this was being worked out according to beliefs and reason and everything else. Anyway, the Queen was French, and the king was actually an Irishman who had moved to Wales and established a large inroad of property ownership and claim in Wales. And what happened then was that the king basically broke the marriage contract, and the Queen's relatives then went to rescue her and to to retain their claim on Powys in central England, because once the king broke the marriage contract, all bets were off, and they reasserted their claim on Powys in central England. So you had the French with a irrefutable claim on Powys, which was a very large part of central England.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the whole thing gets going with Edward the Confessor and William of Normandy. William of Normandy still has claim to Powys in central England because of that.
Okay.
And Edward the Confessor looked at it and said, yeah, well, we know it's true. You really are the lawful king of that part of England, and that is the substantial part of England, and yes, you have subsidiary claims, and because they broke the contract, then Wales is forfeit, and oh heck, I might as well just give it all to you as my heir. So Edward the Confessor agreed to this because it was the right and fair thing to do. And William of Normandy said, okay, well, that's righteous. And, he waited then as a respectful heir for Edward the Confessor to die, which he did. At which point, the will was read, so to speak, and it was not a result that anyone expected, and it was not a result that anyone there was prepared to accept. So they said, well, we'll just kind of ignore that happened, and we'll put up King Harold instead, a man more suitable to our thinking. At which point, William over in Normandy is scratching his head and saying, I've had about enough. They broke faith with me. They said they were going to do this. They said this was right and fair. I'm going to go kick their rumps. And so he did.
Oh.
And that's how the Norman Conquest came to be. And that is how a Norman king came to be the King of England. He was already the King of England by rights, but he went over and he won it by arms.
Gotcha. Wow, that's an incredible story.
And you never heard that in a history book or in a history class either, did you?
No.
No, but you can see it. You can look at it, you can see the history, you can see the progression of the names, you can track it back and forth across the continents, and you can track it through the families. And there it is. And if you want to, you can even go find the actual site of Camelot.
And the story with regard to Camelot that was so beautifully written is that I think it was the king. I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember exactly, but he, or the heir to Camelot, he fell asleep and had this wonderful dream about a free, spirited place that was, incredibly abundant, and people were abundant, and they had peaceful lives, and et cetera, et cetera. And when he woke up, he was so enamored with that dream that he strove to recreate that dream.
Right. Camelot was meant to be heaven on earth. And the church, of course, poo-pooed this whole idea because they can only conceive of heaven being somewhere else and them being in charge of this.
Right.
Wait for your reward. It's coming.
Right.
It's always coming. It's never here.
Right.
We never actually reform the world, and we never seize it from Satan, and we never make it into what it's supposed to be. We just wait and defer that until you're dead, and at that point it doesn't matter. Ha ha. And I'm afraid that Lancelot de Lac was not of that persuasion. He very much conceived of it being possible to cheat the devil of his position, because, well, I don't mean that cheat in the, like a
Right.
dice game.
No.
I mean that by making our own decisions and by following the solid teachings of love and freedom of free will and the universal law of doing no harm, that we could arrive at heaven on earth, and we could take the deceitful, nasty kingdom of the devil away from him, as was mandated, because after all, he lost it all at Golgotha.
Right. And the devil lives under the doctrine of scarcity. We live under the doctrine of love, truth, and abundance.
Yes. So Camelot was an effort back then to create heaven on earth and to dismantle the chains and the deceptions and the evil and the oppression of Satan's world. And there's actually a reason that the Kennedys are associated with Camelot. Remember, the Queen married an Irish king?
That's the connection.
Right, because after the big battle of Canlan, when Lancelot was victorious, although Camelot itself was ruined, the king repented all that he had done. And so his lineage was not stricken, and he remained, the children and everybody, the cousins and everybody, remained part of the inheritance of Camelot, which is a spiritual inheritance.
Wow.
And therefore JFK was an inheritor of Camelot.
Wow. That's fascinating.